The clock on the courthouse wall read 11:35 p.m. when Judge Elijah Washington finally closed the last case file. He rubbed his tired eyes and loosened his tie, the weight of the day's decisions heavy on his shoulders. 12 hours in court today, but that was nothing new for him. For 27 years, he'd built a reputation as one of the hardest-working judges in the district. The parking garage was nearly empty as his footsteps echoed against the concrete. His old sedan waited in the corner spot, nothing flashy for a federal judge, just reliable. That was Elijah's way. His mother had taught him that true respect comes from actions, not appearances. The night air felt good after hours in the stuffy courtroom. Elijah rolled down his window as he drove through downtown, the streets quiet except for a few late-night restaurants still glowing with life. He thought about calling his wife Amara, but decided against it. She had early surgeries tomorrow, and he hoped she was already asleep. The red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror just as he turned onto Oak Street, about 3 miles from home. Elijah checked his speed, 5 under the limit. He signaled and pulled over properly, reaching for his wallet before the officer approached. 2 officers walked up to his car, flashlights aimed directly at his face, making it hard to see them clearly. Elijah squinted against the harsh light. "License and registration," the taller officer demanded without greeting. "No, sir," no explanation for the stop. "Good evening, officers," Elijah said calmly, handing over his documents. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" "Broken taillight," the second officer said, that Elijah had just had his car serviced last week. The taller officer studied his license with a frown. "Judge Washington, huh? What's a judge doing out this late? Seems suspicious." "I was working late at the courthouse," Elijah explained, maintaining his composure despite the officer's tone. "I'm heading home now." The officers exchanged glances. The second one circled the car, shining his flashlight through each window. "Step out of the vehicle," the taller officer ordered suddenly. "May I ask why that's necessary?" "I've provided my—" "I said step out of the vehicle." The officer's hand moved to his holster. Elijah felt a chill run through him. In 27 years on the bench, he'd learned to read people. Something wasn't right, but arguing would only escalate things. He slowly opened his door. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked. Elijah stood beside his car, hands visible, the cool night air now feeling cold against his skin. "Officers, I'm a federal judge. If there's an issue with my vehicle, I'd appreciate." "You think being a judge means special treatment?" The second officer cut in, stepping uncomfortably close. "You people always think rules don't apply to you." A car slowed as it passed by. Someone was watching, phone likely recording. The taller officer noticed too and seemed agitated by the attention. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered. "This is unnecessary," Elijah said firmly. "I've cooperated fully. If there's a taillight issue, please write the citation end." He didn't finish his sentence before they spun him around, slamming him against his car. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists as the officers roughly secured them. "You're under arrest for resisting and disorderly conduct," the taller officer announced loudly, clearly performing for the growing audience of passing cars and pedestrians who had stopped to watch. "I've done nothing wrong," Elijah stated clearly, making sure witnesses could hear. "This is—" "Shut up," the second officer hissed, leaning in close enough that only Elijah could hear his next words. "Your fancy robe don't mean nothing out here, boy." The word hung in the air between them. Elijah felt his heart pounding, but kept his face neutral. 27 years on the bench, 14 years as a prosecutor before that. He'd faced down murderers and kingpins, but standing there in handcuffs on a public street, he felt a vulnerability he hadn't experienced since childhood. As they pushed him toward the patrol car, Elijah noticed at least 3 people filming now. Good, let them record. Let them see what happens when authority operates without accountability. The back of the police car smelled like bleach and something worse underneath. As the door slammed shut, Elijah Washington, federal judge of the 9th District Court, took a deep breath and began mentally recording every detail of what had just happened. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The holding cell smelled of sweat and despair. Judge Elijah Washington sat on the hard bench, his suit wrinkled and his dignity bruised. For the first time in decades, he was on the wrong side of the justice system. The irony wasn't lost on him as he watched the clock tick past 3 a.m. 2 cells down, a young man sobbed quietly. Across the hall, 3 men played cards with a deck so worn the numbers were barely visible. None of them looked surprised to see a well-dressed black man in their midst. That reality hit Elijah harder than the arrest itself. "Washington. Phone call," a guard announced, unlocking his cell. Amara's voice was steady when he picked up, but he knew his wife well enough to hear the fear underneath her composure. "I'm fine," he assured her before she could ask. "They're claiming I resisted arrest and became disorderly. It's nonsense." "Thomas is on his way," she said, referring to their family attorney and longtime friend. "The videos are already everywhere, Elijah. People are outraged." "Videos?" He straightened his back. "At least 3 different angles. Someone posted them an hour ago. They're spreading like wildfire." A flicker of hope ignited in his chest. Witnesses, evidence. The very things he'd relied on in his courtroom for decades. By sunrise, Thomas had arrived, briefcase in hand and fury in his eyes. "This is a disgrace," he muttered as they huddled in the consultation room. "The officers claim you were belligerent and refused to comply with lawful orders." "You know that's not true," Elijah said, exhaustion making his voice rough. "Of course I know. The whole internet knows. Look." Thomas slid his phone across the table. The video had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views. The comments section was a firestorm of anger and support. #Judge Washington was trending nationwide. By noon, the police department had issued their statement. The officers involved followed standard protocol when faced with an uncooperative subject. "We are reviewing the incident internally." Standard protocol. Uncooperative subject. The words made Elijah's stomach turn as he was finally released on his own recognizance, the magistrate looking deeply uncomfortable during the brief hearing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like hungry insects. "Judge Washington, how does it feel to be on the other side of the bench? Will you be filing a lawsuit against the police department? Do you believe you were targeted because of your race?" Thomas created a barrier between Elijah and the microphones. "My client has no comment at this time. He has cooperated fully with authorities and looks forward to clearing his name." Amara waited in the car, her surgeon's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles showed white. When he slid into the passenger seat, she reached over and touched his face gently, checking for injuries with practiced precision. "I'm okay," he assured her, though they both knew it wasn't true. The drive home was silent, but their phones buzzed constantly. Colleagues, friends, family, all calling to express shock, support, and in some cases, surprising silence. The chief judge had left a carefully worded voicemail about taking some time and weathering the storm. Translation: "Stay away from the courthouse until this blows over." Their home looked different somehow when they pulled into the driveway. Reporters had already found their address, camping out at the edge of their property. Neighbors peeked through curtains, curious and uncomfortable. Inside, Elijah showered for a long time, trying to wash away the smell of the holding cell. When he emerged, Amara had set up command central in their dining room, laptop open, phone charging, legal pads ready. "The department is already trying to control the narrative," she said, scrolling through news reports. "They've pulled up a 20-year-old traffic ticket and your participation in last year's Community Police Oversight Committee as evidence you have anti-police bias." Elijah laughed bitterly. "I sentenced a corrupt officer in my first year on the bench. They've never forgotten it." Their doorbell rang, making them both jump. Thomas had returned with unexpected company, Congresswoman Helen Chen, whose district included their neighborhood. "This isn't just about you, Elijah," the Congresswoman said after they settled in the living room. "Those officers have histories, complaints that were buried, transfers from other precincts after incidents. You're just the first person with enough power to make people listen." Elijah looked at the 3 determined faces around him, his brilliant wife, his loyal friend, and a congresswoman he'd only met at fundraisers. Behind them, his phone continued to light up with notifications. People were watching, waiting, wondering what a federal judge would do when the system that elevated him suddenly turned against him. For 27 years, he'd followed the rules, trusted the process, believed in the system. Now, sitting in his own living room, feeling like a stranger in his own skin, Judge Elijah Washington made a decision that would change everything. "I won't be quiet," he said finally. "And I won't be going away." Amara reached for his hand, squeezing tightly. "They picked the wrong man to make an example of," she said softly. "They just don't know it yet." The conference room at Thomas's law firm buzzed with tension. 5 days had passed since the arrest, and Judge Elijah Washington sat at the head of the table, tie perfectly knotted despite the chaos swirling around him. Across from him, Thomas and 2 other attorneys from his firm waited with legal pads and concerned expressions. "The department has offered a deal," Thomas said, sliding a document across the polished table. "They'll drop all charges if you agree not to pursue any legal action against the officers or the department. They're also asking for a joint press statement saying it was all a misunderstanding." Elijah didn't even touch the paper. "A misunderstanding?" "They're scared," said Renee, one of Thomas's partners. "The videos have over 10 million views now. Civil rights groups are organizing protests. The mayor's office has been flooded with calls." "What about the officers?" Elijah asked. "Paid administrative leave while an internal investigation takes place," Thomas replied with a grimace. "Which means nothing will happen." Elijah stood and walked to the window. Below, the city sprawled out before him, the same city where he'd built his career, raised his children, believed in justice. The same city where he'd been handcuffed and humiliated for driving while black. "I've been on the bench for almost 3 decades," he said quietly. "I've watched the same story play out hundreds of times. Someone is wronged by those sworn to protect. Evidence disappears. Investigations go nowhere. Eventually, people forget and move on." He turned to face them. "But not this time." Renee leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" "I'm going to represent myself." The room fell silent. Thomas recovered first. "Elijah, with all due respect, you're a federal judge, not a litigator. You haven't practiced law in 27 years. "I know." Elijah sat back down. "But I was a prosecutor for 14 years before that. And more importantly, I'm the one person they can't dismiss as having an agenda." "The media will call it a publicity stunt," warned the third attorney, a young man named David. "Let them," Elijah replied. "I spent my entire career following rules, believing the system works if you just respect the process. Then I spent a night in jail because 2 officers decided the law didn't apply to them." His voice remained calm, but his eyes burned with determination. "I have resources, connections, and knowledge of the law that most victims of police misconduct could never dream of. If I walk away now, what message does that send?" Thomas sighed, recognizing the look on his old friend's face. "You'll need a team. Investigators, paralegals, media management." "I know." "The police union will come after you. Hard." "I'd expect nothing less." "The other judges may see this as problematic." Elijah smiled for the first time that day. "Let them try to explain why pursuing justice is problematic." By afternoon, the news had broken. Federal Judge to read carries ANT HMCLF NCASEAGLINST POLICE. Every major network picked up the story. Phones at the law firm rang constantly. Amara called to say reporters had formed a permanent camp outside their home. At 6 p.m., Elijah held his first press conference on the steps of the courthouse where he'd worked for decades. Cameras flashed as he approached the microphones, Amara at his side. "Good evening," he began, his deep voice steady. "My name is Judge Elijah Washington. 5 days ago, I was unlawfully arrested while driving home from work. The officers involved used excessive force, made racist remarks, and falsified reports about the incident." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Today, I declined an offer to sweep this under the rug. Instead, I am announcing my intention to represent myself in pursuing justice, not just for what happened to me, but for what happens every day to people who don't have my resources and platform." A reporter shouted, "Isn't this a conflict of interest with your position on the bench?" Elijah nodded, having anticipated the question. "I will be taking a leave of absence from my judicial duties while this case proceeds. Justice cannot be a part-time commitment." Another called out, "Do you really think one case can change anything?" "I think silence never changed anything," he replied. "Throughout history, systems only change when brave individuals refuse to accept injustice as normal." He looked directly into the cameras. "I've spent my life interpreting the law. Now I intend to make sure it applies to everyone equally, including those who enforce it." As questions continued to fly, Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "Not all cops are bad. Some of us want the truth too. Check your email." Back at the law firm, Elijah opened his laptop to find an anonymous email containing internal department records. Complaint forms, disciplinary reports, transfer documents, all relating to Officers Peterson and Donnelly, the men who had arrested him. "My God," Thomas whispered, looking over his shoulder. "Someone inside is helping you." Elijah scrolled through the documents, each one revealing a pattern of misconduct stretching back years: excessive force complaints, racial profiling allegations, all buried or dismissed. "This isn't just about my case anymore," Elijah said, printing the documents with hands that didn't quite stay steady. "This is about a system that protects its worst while punishing anyone who speaks up." As he organized the papers, Elijah thought about the young man he'd seen crying in the holding cell. How many others had these same officers terrorized? How many didn't have videos or connections or law degrees? "Thomas," he said quietly, "I need to do more than just clear my name." His friend nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I've already scheduled meetings with the ACLU and the Department of Justice. This just became a class action." For the first time since those red and blue lights had flashed in his mirror, Judge Elijah Washington felt something like hope. 3 weeks after his arrest, Judge Elijah Washington's temporary office at Thomas's law firm looked like a war room. Corkboards covered the walls, pinned with photos, documents, and red string connecting the pieces. Laptops and coffee cups cluttered every surface. A team of volunteer paralegals and law students worked in shifts, following leads and organizing evidence. Elijah stood before the largest board, studying the faces of Officers Peterson and Donnelly. Below their photos were timelines of their careers, stations, partners, complaints, and commendations. "They've worked together for 7 years," said Keisha, a third-year law student who'd volunteered to help the case. "First at the 5th precinct, then the 12th, now the 8th. 3 different precincts in 7 years isn't normal." "They follow each other," Elijah noted. "When one transfers, the other follows within weeks." Keisha nodded. "And look at this pattern. Complaints spike, they transfer, complaints start again at the new location." Amara entered with a tray of sandwiches, insisting everyone take a break. She'd taken leave from the hospital to support her husband's case, putting her surgical career temporarily on hold. "You need to eat," she told Elijah, who hadn't touched food since morning. "You can't fight corruption on an empty stomach." As the team ate, Elijah's phone rang, another unknown number. These calls had become common since his press conference. Some were threats, quickly reported to security. Others were tips, carefully vetted by the team. This one was different. "Judge Washington, my name is Officer Louis Rivera. I work at the 8th precinct with Peterson and Donnelly." Elijah muted his phone and put it on speaker, waving his team over. "Yes, Officer Rivera. What can I do for you?" "I was there the night you were arrested. I was in the 2nd patrol car. I didn't step in when I should have." The man's voice trembled slightly. "And I'm not the only one who's watched them cross lines." "Are you willing to make a statement?" Elijah asked, heart pounding. "I can do better than that. There's a group of us, officers who are sick of covering for them. We have documentation, incident reports that were altered, bodycam footage that disappeared, text messages about targeting certain neighborhoods." Thomas scribbled furiously on a legal pad, "Get him PORTTCHIN. Officer Rivera, your testimony could be crucial. But I need to warn you about potential consequences." "I know the risks." The man's voice hardened. "My father was an immigrant who taught me to respect this country and its laws. The badge I wear is supposed to stand for something. What Peterson and Donnelly do, that's not policing. That's bullying with government backing." By evening, Elijah's team had arranged a secure meeting with Rivera and 4 other officers from 3 different precincts. They gathered at a private room in Thomas's office building, away from windows and curious eyes. One by one, they shared stories that made Elijah's blood run cold. "They call certain neighborhoods hunting grounds," said Rivera. Officer Chen, a 10-year veteran, added, "They have a point system, more points for arrests in certain neighborhoods or of certain types of people. When complaints come in, the higher-ups tell us to stick together," said Officer Wilson, the oldest of the group. "They remind us about our pensions, our families. They talk about loyalty." Officer Thompson, a young woman who'd only been on the force for 2 years, slid a flash drive across the table. "I copied this from Peterson's computer when he was out sick. It's his personal record of arrests with his own notes. He doesn't know I have it." "And this," said the fifth officer, Detective Powell, placing a thick folder on the table, "is every internal affairs complaint filed against either of them in the last 5 years. Some were lost. Others were closed without investigation. I've been collecting them." Elijah looked at the 5 officers, diverse in age, gender, and ethnicity, but united in their disgust at what they'd witnessed. "You understand what you're doing?" he asked softly. "The department will close ranks. Your colleagues may turn against you. Your careers could be over." Officer Wilson let out a bitter laugh. "My career was over the day I realized what I was part of and stayed anyway. This is about redemption now." Back at the law firm, working late into the night, Elijah and Thomas reviewed the mountain of new evidence. The flash drive contained hundreds of entries, each more damning than the last. "Officer Peterson has a detailed system," Thomas noted, scrolling through spreadsheets. "He tracks demographics, neighborhoods, time of day. It's all coded but obvious what he's doing." "It's not just racial profiling," Elijah added, examining another document. "It's targeting anyone he perceives as powerless. Immigrants, teenagers, people who might not speak English well." "Until he picked you," Thomas said. "A federal judge with resources and knowledge." "Their mistake," Elijah replied grimly. The next morning, Elijah filed an expanded lawsuit with the federal court. No longer just focused on his own arrest, it now alleged a pattern of discriminatory policing throughout the department, with Officers Peterson and Donnelly as the most egregious examples. By noon, the story had exploded again. Department leadership called an emergency press conference, denouncing the rogue officers who had shared information with Elijah's team. The police union issued a statement supporting the accused officers and questioning Elijah's motives. That evening, as Elijah reviewed paperwork at home, his doorbell rang. Amara answered, then called him to the door with urgency in her voice. Standing on their porch was a young man Elijah recognized immediately. The one who had been crying in the holding cell the night of his arrest. "Judge Washington, my name is Andrew Taylor. I saw you in that cell, and now I see you on the news." He gestured to a dozen other people standing behind him on the sidewalk. "We all have stories about those same officers, and we all want to help." Elijah looked at the faces gathered in the twilight, people of all ages and backgrounds, united by their experiences. "Come in," he said, opening his door wider. "We have a lot of work to do." 2 months into the battle, Judge Elijah Washington felt the weight of resistance growing heavier each day. The blue wall had solidified. The police union had hired 3 top-tier law firms. The department's PR team worked overtime, painting Elijah as a privileged judge with a vendetta against hard-working officers. Anonymous threats arrived daily. Suspicious cars drove slowly past their home at night. Twice, Elijah found his tires slashed. Amara received calls at the hospital questioning her medical credentials. Their son, a college professor across the country, called to say someone had been asking strange questions about his parents. "They're trying to scare us," Amara said as they sat in their kitchen one morning, curtains drawn. "They want us to give up." Elijah nodded, exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. "It's working on our supporters too. 3 of our witnesses have backed out this week alone." "Do you ever think about taking their deal?" she asked softly. "For our safety." Elijah looked at her, this woman who had stood beside him for 30 years. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Then I remember Andra and the others. They don't have the option to walk away from this reality." The doorbell rang, startling them both. Through the peephole, Elijah saw Thomas, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "You need to see this," Thomas said as soon as they let him in, opening his laptop on their kitchen table. "Someone sent it anonymously to my office an hour ago." On screen, a video played, clearly from a police body camera. Officer Donnelly's voice was unmistakable as he spoke to his partner, Officer Peterson, unaware that his camera was recording. "The chief wants this Washington problem to go away," Donnelly said. "Says we stirred up a hornet's nest." "It'll blow over," Peterson replied. "They'll find something on him or his wife or that professor's son of theirs. Everyone's got dirt." "What if they don't? What if those internal affairs files get into the wrong hands? You know who signed off on burying those complaints?" The video continued, revealing names of higher-ups who had systematically protected the two officers over the years. Captains, deputy chiefs, even the police commissioner had knowledge of their conduct. "This goes to the top," Thomas said quietly when the video ended. "They're not just protecting two bad officers, they're protecting a system. Can we authenticate this?" Elijah asked. "Already working on it. Our tech team says the metadata is consistent with department bodycams, no signs of tampering." The phone rang. It was Keisha, the law student. "Judge Washington, you need to see the news right now." Elijah turned on the television to find every channel covering the same story. 5 more officers had come forward publicly, standing with Officer Rivera at a press conference, describing a department culture that rewarded aggressive policing in minority neighborhoods and punished those who spoke up. "We've been silent too long," Rivera said to the cameras. "Judge Washington had the courage to fight back. We need the same courage." By afternoon, the story had exploded. The mayor called for an independent investigation. The Department of Justice announced it was reviewing the case. Social media erupted with hundreds of personal stories about encounters with the police department. That evening, as Elijah prepared for a strategy meeting, his phone rang, the police commissioner himself. "Judge Washington," the commissioner began, his voice strained. "I think it's time we talked directly. This situation has escalated beyond what's good for the city." "I agree, Commissioner, but I'm not interested in backdoor deals. What if I told you we're prepared to implement real reforms? Body cameras that can't be turned off, civilian review boards with actual power, transparent disciplinary procedures." Elijah paused, hearing the desperation in the man's voice. "Those are good starts, but what about Officers Peterson and Donnelly? They'll be terminated immediately, and we won't fight charges if the district attorney pursues them. And the higher-ups who protected them all these years?" Silence stretched across the line. Finally, the commissioner sighed. "That's complicated." "No, Commissioner, that's the whole point. Nothing changes if the culture of protection remains intact. I have evidence implicating at least 7 ranking officers in covering up misconduct. Either they go too, or we'll see each other in court." The commissioner's voice hardened. "You're asking for the dismantling of our entire command structure. The department would be in chaos." "Then rebuild it properly," Elijah replied, "with people who understand that the badge is about protection and service, not power and control." After the call ended, Thomas looked at Elijah with concern. "They'll fight back harder now. You've backed them into a corner." "Good," Elijah said. "Cornered opponents make mistakes." The prediction proved accurate faster than anyone expected. That night, someone leaked years of internal emails between department leadership discussing how to handle problem officers, including Peterson and Donnelly. The emails revealed a calculated system of transfers, buried complaints, and intimidation of victims who filed reports. By morning, protesters had surrounded police headquarters. The mayor called an emergency press conference, distancing herself from the commissioner. 3 deputy chiefs announced early retirement. At noon, Elijah received another call from the commissioner, his voice now defeated. "What are your terms?" Elijah had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Full amnesty for the officers who came forward. A civilian oversight board with real authority. Mandatory body cameras with strict penalties for tampering. Transparency in complaint processes, and psychological evaluations for all officers, starting with leadership positions. And what about those of us at the top? Resignation or prosecution, your choice. That evening, as Elijah and Amara watched the news, the commissioner announced his resignation, effective immediately. 2 deputy chiefs and 4 captains followed suit. The mayor appointed Officer Rivera to a new task force on departmental reform. The phone hadn't stopped ringing all day. Reporters, supporters, and finally, Andrew Taylor. "Did you see the news, Judge?" His voice brimmed with something Elijah hadn't heard before, hope. "I did. They actually listened. They're actually changing things. Elijah smiled his first genuine smile in weeks. It's just the beginning, Andra. We have a lot more work to do. As he hung up, Amara squeezed his hand. You stood your ground when everyone expected you to fall. Elijah looked at the wall of their home, where photos of their family through the years reminded him of all he had to lose and all they had to gain. Sometimes, he said quietly, the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Elijah Washington approached the stand. After months of investigation, evidence gathering, and legal maneuvering, the day of testimony had finally arrived. The room was packed with journalists, community members, and fellow judges who had come to witness this unprecedented moment, a federal judge testifying against police officers in a case he himself had filed. Officers Peterson and Donnelly sat at the defense table, their faces blank masks hiding whatever emotions churned beneath. Their new lawyers, paid for by the police union's dwindling legal fund, whispered urgently between themselves. As Elijah took the oath, he caught Amara's eye in the front row. She nodded slightly, her quiet strength flowing across the room to him. Beside her sat Andra Taylor and several others who had come forward with their own stories of mistreatment by the same officers. Judge Washington began. The special prosecutor appointed to the case. Please tell the court about the night of April 15th. Elijah took a deep breath and began his testimony, his deep voice steady and clear. He described a late night at his chambers, the drive home, the flashing lights that appeared in his mirror. He recounted every word, every action, every moment of humiliation and fear as the officers had handcuffed him without cause. And when Officer Donnelly leaned in close to you, what did he say? The prosecutor asked. He said, your fancy row don't mean nothing out here, boy. Elijah's voice didn't waver on the slur, but many in the courtroom flinched. How did that make you feel, Judge Washington? Elijah paused, considering the question. I've been a judge for 27 years. Before that, I was a prosecutor for 14. I've spent my entire adult life believing in our justice system, upholding it, defending it. His eyes moved to the officers. In that moment, I felt something I haven't felt since I was a child growing up in the South, powerless. Not because I couldn't fight back physically, but because I realized that to these officers, the law itself didn't matter. My position didn't matter. My rights didn't matter. Nothing mattered except their power in that moment. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination, his strategy clear from the first question. Judge Washington, isn't it true that you've had run-ins with the police department before? That you've sentenced officers to prison? That you might harbor resentment against law enforcement? I sentenced people from all walks of life when they broke the law, Elijah replied calmly, including police officers, teachers, bankers, and other judges. The law applies equally to all. And yet here you are, using your considerable influence to pursue a personal vendetta. Objection. The prosecutor jumped to her feet. Argumentative. Sustained, said the judge overseeing the case, a retired jurist brought in from another district. The cross-examination continued for hours, the defense attorney trying to rattle Elijah, to catch him in a contradiction or force him to lose his composure. Elijah remained steady, answering each question with the patience and precision that had defined his career on the bench. During a brief recess, Thomas approached him in the hallway. You're doing great. The jury is with you. I can see it in their faces. Elijah nodded, taking a sip of water. What about the next witness? Ready to go. And wait until you see what the tech team found last night. Thomas lowered his voice. They recovered deleted text messages from Peterson's phone. Messages to someone in the department leadership about teaching the judge a lesson. Premeditation, Elijah whispered. Exactly. This wasn't a random traffic stop gone wrong. They targeted you specifically. When court resumed, Officer Louis Rivera took the stand. Unlike Elijah, he visibly trembled as he was sworn in. His career, his pension, his reputation in the community, all were on the line as he prepared to testify against fellow officers. Officer Rivera, the prosecutor began, what happened after Judge Washington was arrested? Back at the station, Officers Peterson and Donnelly were laughing about it. They called it their biggest trophy yet. They said they'd been watching the judge for weeks, waiting for a chance to pull him over. And did you report this behavior? Rivera's eyes lowered. No, ma'am, I did not. Why not? Because I've seen what happens to officers who speak up. He looked directly at the jury. Your tires get slashed. You get called to dangerous locations without backup. Reports disappear. Evidence goes missing. It's not just about losing friends, it's about safety. What changed your mind? Rivera straightened in his seat. When I saw Judge Washington decide to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone these officers had bullied over the years, I realized I had a choice. I could be part of the problem or part of the solution. As the day's testimony concluded, Elijah walked out of the courthouse flanked by Thomas and security personnel. A crowd had gathered outside, holding signs and chanting support. Among them were faces Elijah recognized, people who had come forward with their own stories, officers who had risked their careers, community members who had lived under the shadow of corrupted authority for years. A small boy, no more than 7 years old, broke away from his mother and ran toward Elijah, stopping just in front of him. "Are you the judge who's standing up to the bad police?" he asked, his voice clear in the sudden hush. Elijah knelt down, meeting the child's eyes. "I'm just someone who believes the law should protect all of us equally." The boy nodded seriously. "When I grow up, I want to be like you." As Elijah stood, the crowd erupted in applause. For the first time since that night of flashing lights and handcuffs, Judge Elijah Washington felt something he hadn't expected to find in this battle, hope that real change might actually be possible. 1 year later, Judge Elijah Washington stood at the podium in City Hall, looking out at faces that had become familiar during the long months of struggle. The large room was filled beyond capacity. Community members, police officers, city officials, and reporters all gathered for what many were calling a historic day. Today, Elijah began, his deep voice carrying easily through the space, "We don't celebrate a victory. We mark a beginning." Behind him sat the mayor, the new police commissioner, and representatives from community organizations that had supported his fight. In the front row, Amara watched him with pride shining in her eyes, Thomas beside her nodding encouragement. 1 year ago, I experienced something that too many in our community have faced for generations: the humiliation and fear of being treated as less than human by those sworn to protect and serve. Elijah paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. What made my case different wasn't the injustice itself. It was that I had the resources, knowledge, and platform to fight back. Officer Rivera, now promoted to lieutenant and head of the new Community Relations Division, sat with several of the officers who had broken the blue wall of silence. They all wore new badges, redesigned as part of the department's transformation. The easy path would have been private settlement and public silence. The comfortable path would have been to accept apologies and move on. But that path leads exactly where we've always ended up, with temporary outrage followed by business as usual. Elijah gestured to the thick document on the podium before him. This agreement, signed today by city leadership, the police department, and community representatives, isn't just about punishing 2 officers who abused their power. It's about transforming a system that allowed that abuse to flourish. In the back of the room, Officers Peterson and Donnelly stood quietly, their demeanor dramatically different from the arrogant men who had arrested Elijah that night. Their trial had ended with convictions, but instead of pushing for maximum prison sentences, Elijah had advocated for a different approach. "Justice isn't always about punishment," he continued. "Sometimes it's about transformation." Officers Peterson and Donnelly have completed 6 months of restorative justice programming, working directly with communities they once policed unfairly. They've met with families harmed by their actions. They've studied the history of policing in America and its complicated relationship with race. And now they've agreed to become part of the solution, training officers across the country about the dangers of bias and the abuse of power. Peterson nodded slightly, his eyes downcast. The journey from defiance to remorse had been long and painful, documented throughout the highly publicized trial and sentencing. Many had criticized Elijah's push for rehabilitation rather than severe punishment, but he had remained firm in his belief that true change required more than just locking people away. The reforms we implement today include mandatory body cameras that cannot be disabled, civilian oversight with real authority, psychological evaluations and cultural competency training for all officers, transparent disciplinary procedures, community involvement in police training and policies. Andrew Taylor, once the frightened young man in a holding cell, now stood as the elected chair of the new Civilian Oversight Board. The transformation in him over the past year had been remarkable, from victim to advocate to leader. But papers and policies aren't enough, Elijah continued. Real change happens in hearts and minds, in the split-second decisions made during traffic stops, in the daily interactions between officers and the communities they serve. He stepped away from the podium, speaking now without notes. I return to the bench next week, changed by this experience. I've seen our justice system from both sides now. I've felt its weight when it fails. I've witnessed its power when it works as intended. And I've learned that justice isn't something that simply happens. It's something we must actively create together, every day, in big decisions and small moments. The room erupted in applause as Elijah, the mayor, and the new commissioner signed the reform agreement. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for tomorrow's headlines. But the image that would stay with many wasn't the official signing, it was what happened afterward. As the crowd mingled during the reception, a small group formed in one corner: Elijah and Amara, Lieutenant Rivera, Andrew Taylor, and surprisingly, Officers Peterson and Donnelly. Their conversation was private, but observers noted the absence of tension, the presence of something that looked remarkably like mutual respect. Later that evening, as Elijah and Amara finally returned home after a day of interviews and ceremonies, their phone rang. It was a community leader from another city, calling about a similar case of police misconduct making headlines. "They want your help," Amara said, handing him the phone. "Your blueprint for change." Elijah took the phone, tiredness etched in the lines of his face, but determination still burning in his eyes. The fight hadn't ended. In many ways, it had just begun. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in their city but potentially across the country. As he started to share what he'd learned on his journey from victim to advocate to reformer, Elijah caught Amara's smile, proud, loving, and knowing. They had turned pain into purpose, humiliation into hope, and one man's arrest into a movement for change that would continue long after the headlines faded. The system hadn't been perfect. It still wasn't. But for the first time in too long, it was moving in the right direction.